Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our 2023 spring webinar series presented by Newton Conservators. Newton Tree Conservancy is our co-sponsor for this event. Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961 that works to preserve and maintain open space in Newton. And the Newton Tree Conservancy is also a nonprofit organization in Newton that was established in 2008 to restore, enhance, and protect Newton's urban forest, and we work really well together. Our two organizations are pleased to present this opportunity to learn from Hannah Lewis. My name's Beth Wilkinson, and I'll be the moderator of this virtual event. Barbara Bates, as always, is our wonderful technical director. I'd like to give our land acknowledgement. We're grateful for the beauty and sustenance that the land provides for humans and the other creatures with whom we share the earth. We acknowledge the Massachusetts stewardship of this land that kept its ecological communities vibrant, strong, and interconnected for thousands of years, and we hope to work with them as we strive to maintain and restore our open space. In tonight's presentation, Hannah Lewis will tell us what a mini forest is, what it can do for your neighborhood, how to plant one, and why people all over the world are organizing their communities to plant mini forests in the small spaces where they live and work. Hannah Lewis is the author of a wonderful book that I highly recommend called Mini Forest Revolution, Using the Miyawaki Method to Rapidly Rewild the World. She has an MS in Sustainable Agriculture and Sociology from Iowa State University and a BA in Environmental Studies from Middlebury College. Hannah lives in Minneapolis, where she works for the nonprofit Renewing the Countryside to build sustainable local and regional food systems and to plant mini forests. We're really fortunate that Hannah was going to teach us a great way to increase climate resiliency in our community. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you. Thank you, Newton Conservators, and thank you to everybody who's joining the webinar. So thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Hannah Lewis. I work for Renewing the Countryside in Minnesota. And tonight I want to talk to you about a mini forest revolution that is happening all over the world, including Massachusetts. There was a couple mini forests planted in Cambridge recently. So I stumbled onto this mini forest idea when I was working remotely for the Cambridge organization Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. And my job involved writing a semi-annual literature review on the relationship between ecosystems and climate. And what I found fascinating was the great variety of things that healthy ecosystems do that correct many of today's problems. So CO2 buildup in the atmosphere, while leaves transfer carbon from the atmosphere to the living tissue of the land, as we know. But what's important to think about is that the more leaves, the more plants, the denser and vaster the ecosystems, the more CO2 is drawn out of the atmosphere. So there's a relationship. We don't need just a few small ecosystems. We need a lot of healthy ecosystems around the world. Heat waves. A mature tree has the cooling power of several air conditioners, and woody areas of cities are lower temperatures by more than 10 degrees compared to treeless areas nearby. Flooding and drought. The living porous soils of intact ecosystems absorb floodwater, hold on to moisture through droughts, and contribute to plant transpiration, which in turn contributes to rain in a steady, regulated way. Coastal ecosystems slow down storm surges and protect inland areas. And biodiversity loss, another big problem. While ecosystems are made up of the very species we're losing. So I was thinking about how important ecosystems are, and yet what I saw around me, and this is near where we were living when I wrote the book, and this is in France, was scenes like this. This is a very typical scene in Europe, in the US, many parts of the world where you have a street, a mowed grassy strip. You have a few solitary trees there in the background, some buildings, a manicured hedge in the upper right, and then a big parking lot. This parking lot was a really nice place to go roller skating, which is what we were doing that day. And that's really important. And all of these different features are important parts of our communities. But what struck me was that this whole area where we were living, as much of Europe, was once continuous temperate forest. And so in this particular area, there's about 14% forest cover. And so what struck me was that this sort of severe lack of natural ecosystem in our surroundings. And I'm not talking only about France or Europe, but just really US, many parts of the world. This lack of natural ecosystems in our surroundings was a wasted opportunity, not only to mitigate climate change, but also to protect our communities more effectively from extreme weather in the ways that I was describing in the previous slide. So when I read about a couple in a nearby city to where I was living who had planted a tiny native forest beside a recently expanded road, I was all ears. I contacted them right away, and that began my journey into the many forest revolution, which I'm going to talk about. So let's get our terms straight. What do I mean by mini forest revolution? I would like to break that down word by word, starting with forest. So a forest is a broad term. And for instance, the UN defines forest as any area of at least a half a hectare that's covered at least 10% in tree canopy. Ecologically speaking, though, you could say that a forest is a dynamic biological community dominated by trees and involving many plants, animals, microorganisms that are interacting with each other and with the environment as a functional unit. And so that's the definition of forest that we're going to be thinking about here tonight. So a mini forest is exactly that same thing, but it's small enough for us to establish in the spaces around where we live and work, such as at a school, along a roadside, at the edge of a parking lot, or a degraded riverbank like you see here on the lower right or lower left. So these pictures are from Cameroon, and the picture on the lower left is the mini forest site just after it was planted. And so the plants are so small, you don't really see them. You just see the empty space that they were trying to revegetate. The upper right is the local community there that planted it. And the lower right is what that same space looked like a year and a half later after the vegetation had grown in partially. So had started growing in. So Buea, this is in the town of Buea in southern Cameroon, and that's in the Congo Basin rainforest. So actually this area gets lots and lots of rain every year, but the fastly growing city of Buea was losing a lot of forest cover as it was cleared for farmland and development and residences and a university and all sorts of good things, but it was losing forest cover. And what started happening was the water table was dropping. So there was plenty of rain coming down, but it wasn't being held in the soil and in the groundwater. And so normally in the past, what people would do is come to these catchment areas on these rivers or streams that would come with clean water out of the mountains. And then you could fill up, there's a little blue box on the left there with a tap, you could fill that up with clean water for household use, but those catchments were running dry. And so the idea here was to plant native vegetation, regrow that forest in this catchment area, to cool down the water, to clean the water, and to restore the soils and restore their porousness so that when the rain came down, it would be absorbed into the ground and start to build back up the catchment area. And there's this was not the only site that was doing this. There were, I think, at least 5 other catchment sites that just started within the past couple of years to do this restoration in Buea. So that was mini forest, and the other word is revolution. And for me, that word has a couple different meanings here. One of them is as a paradigm shift. So the person who developed the planting method for mini forests said this: the process of restoring green environments to residential and industrial neighborhoods, as well as to spaces in and around transportation and other public facilities, cannot be limited to mere decoration. So my question is, what if we thought of landscaping not only as a way to make our outdoor spaces beautiful and pretty, but also as a way to regenerate ecosystems and connect people to nature? And when ecosystem regeneration is your main objective, the visual outcome of the planting is different. So on the left, you have 2 different examples of really traditional plantings of a spaced out alignment of a single species of tree. You can see the beautiful silhouette of each tree, and you don't see much else vegetation wise. And on the right, you have 2 different mini forest plantings. The upper right is in Japan, and the lower right is in Indiana in the US. And so to me, this vegetation here looks like it grew there on its own, like it was not necessarily even planted. And that's exactly the point of planting a mini forest, because what you're trying to do is regrow the vegetation that would be growing in any given site if it had never been cleared in the first place. And so instead of planting trees as beautiful individuals, you're planting trees that are members of a biological community, where the interactions between the different plants and the microorganisms and the animals are boosting the vitality of the system as a whole. And so the other sense of the word revolution is just referring to how quickly the idea of planting these ecologically robust mini forests is taking off around the world just in the past 5 to 10 years. So for my book, I had the privilege of interviewing people planting mini forests in their communities in India, Iran, Japan, China, Cameroon, the Netherlands, France, England, and the US. And my book documents just a small sample of the many new projects all around the world. So how do we plant a mini forest? We use the Miyawaki method, and I'll introduce Akira Miyawaki, the method's founder, in a minute, but for now, let's have a look at his tree planting approach. So it rests on five key variables. So one is species composition. We're planting the native climax forest species that are native to that particular site. And then vegetation structure. We're not planting only the tall canopy trees, but also mid-sized trees and shrubs to make up the layers of a natural forest. And then we're often starting with degraded soil. So we need to loosen it up and add a lot of organic material to approximate the loose, living, thick soil that you would find in a mature forest. And then density. We're planting 3 per square yard. But if you think about those different layers, we're not planting necessarily 3 plants that are going to be the same height in that area. So we're using the vertical space as well. And then mulch, since we're planting when the plants are still really small, just a couple, 3 years old, they don't have many leaves or canopy yet. So the soil is kind of exposed. So we need to really heavily mulch that soil to protect it until that canopy grows out and shades out weeds and holds moisture in the site. So I mentioned climax forest species, and those are the shade tolerant trees that grow in towards the end of the process of natural ecological succession. So here's a timeline that is 100 to 200 years long, or it could be many, many years longer than that, depending on where you are, what the biome is. And on the left is bare ground. And so as you move through time, the first plants that start to colonize bare ground are fast growing small annual plants that make a lot of seeds, die quickly. And then you get longer living perennial herbs, grasses, forbs, and then shrubs and pioneer trees. And so the vegetation is getting bigger, longer living. And as these different vegetation communities come through this area, and they're actually changing the conditions of the site. They're adding organic material to the ground. They're holding moisture better. They're creating shade. They're loosening up the ground with their roots. And so with those changed conditions, that invites different types of plants to come in. So towards the end of this process, you get these shade tolerant plants that can germinate in that shade and grow up. And once they push through and take over the canopy, they create sort of a self-perpetuating biological community that shades out any of the earlier successional species that needed light. And so you can have that climax community in a site without disturbances, in the absence of disturbances for hundreds or thousands of years. And so the Miyawaki method sidesteps the natural successional process by planting the climax species directly. But first, we need to acknowledge and do the work of improving the soil that those earlier successional species would have done, which is why we go ahead and decompact the ground and add organic material before planting. So one of Miyawaki's colleagues was an ecologist named Elgene Box, who is retired now, but he was with the University of Georgia. And he said this: the logic of Miyawaki's method is to create a permanent canopy of climax species trees directly without going through the successional stages. And this creates a more humid, shady forest microclimate as quickly as possible. And that's an important point because one of the things people like about the Miyawaki method is that it becomes a self-sustaining ecosystem, not needing any more maintenance after just a couple or 3 years. So in the first few summers, there's still lots of light coming in. You need to weed out grasses and other plants that are growing there, and then also you need to water. But once that canopy forms, so the plants that you've put in are growing in kind of ideal conditions. They have great soil and they're pretty close together. So as they're growing, they're reaching out and touching their neighbors, and that canopy forms, which then kind of is able to hold the moisture in the system better and shade out the weeds. So that's a pretty key idea with the method. So that was the method. And now I'm going to introduce you to Japanese botanist, Dr. Akira Miyawaki, who I really, really, really loved learning about through the process of researching for the book. And he was actually terminally ill when I was writing the book. So I wasn't able to speak to him, but I did get to read. He wrote a lot of articles, and he was interviewed a lot. So I really got a chance to absorb his character, his personality, his vision, and a lot of his knowledge and of forest planting. And so he was prolific as a scientist, and he was also deeply engaged as a citizen of the world. One of his early projects was mapping out the vegetation of Japan. And so this allowed him to understand what kind of vegetation grows in any given place, based on the climate, the soils, the topography, and the disturbance, whether that's human or natural disturbance. And that is sort of, that's what shapes the vegetation communities that appear in any given site. And so this was really informative for his forest planting approach. So he went on to plant forests in 3,000 places, mostly in Japan, but also in more than a dozen other countries. And so that really gives us a sense for his depth of engagement in the world. And he said in his acceptance speech for the Blue Planet Prize in 2006, this is one of many, many quotes that I just really treasure from Miyawaki, but this one, I really like it, and it's very straightforward. He said, "I myself am resolved to continue to plant trees, starting from where I stand and spreading to the whole world, so long as I have life left in my body." And he did just that. So here you can see on the picture on the right, he's 86 years old, leading a planting festival at a Japanese-based auto parts plant in Madison, Indiana in 2014. And this was the first of 6 annual events where workers and their families planted strips of native forest along the perimeter of the company's property. And for the planting festivals like this one that Miyawaki led, it wasn't just to restore the land. It was also a huge component of it was educational. So, always trying to get a lot of people to participate in these events. I mean, hundreds or thousands in some cases. And then not only to, give people the experience of planting trees, but also to help them connect with those trees and know their names and be able to identify them. So each planting festival started with a naming ceremony. And so one person would hold up a handful of the main species that they were going to be planting and say the name of that species. And the whole group gathered would then repeat the name. And there were the potted plants kind of lined up with their names and pictures of what they would look like when they were older. So the educational component was really a big part. And one of the reasons that Miyawaki reached so many places outside of Japan was through partnerships with Japanese companies who connected him to their overseas facilities, like this one in Indiana. And that is actually a really important part of the story, because in 2009, Miyawaki led a planting festival at a Toyota plant in Bangalore, India, where one of the workers was an engineer named Shubhendu Sharma, and he volunteered for the planting day. And that experience sort of actually changed his life, hit him over the head, and made him really, really interested in forests. And he had been an engineer before, but he was fascinated by how this idea that you could assemble the different parts of a forest, not just trees, but many other parts of a forest, and that you would get a functional forest. And so he dove into research on his own time. He planted an experimental forest in his backyard and saw 9 different bird species arrive in his backyard that he had never observed before, that were attracted by that forest. And so he eventually decided to leave his job as an engineer and start a forest planting company, even though he liked his job. But he said, this is something, referring to the Miyawaki Method, everyone should know. So his forest planting company, he was planting forests. He was teaching people in India and elsewhere. how to do it. And then in 2014, he gave a TED Talk, which had over 1 million views and sparked a new wave of forest makers across Europe and the world. So now I'm going to introduce you to some of those forest makers that were inspired by Shubendu to plant mini forests. So one of them was a Beirut architect named Adib Dada. And Adib had long been troubled by the condition of the Beirut River, which you can see there on the left, which had been channelized in 1968 to mitigate flooding on the banks which were being developed. And this is something that other places have done. A good example of a similar paving of a river is Los Angeles, and for the same reasons. But for Adib, this was no longer an riparian ecosystem where the water interacted with the vegetation in the water and the banks. And this was now more like a sewage channel through the city, because trash ended up heaped in it, and it was the water was not clean anymore, and it was not interacting with the land at all. So he had spent a certain amount of time, doing public outreach, trying to get a public conversation started about the importance of ecosystems, even in cities. And he felt that, presentations and things like that weren't grabbing people's attention enough. So when he heard about the Miyawaki Method through Shubendu, he jumped at the opportunity. He invited Shubendu to lead the first planting of this site right here by the river. And so that was in, I think, 2019. And they have subsequently added to that site in this very same part of the river in subsequent years. And so this is all native forest, and it's an invitation to people to start thinking about green space in the city, which is pretty minimal in this very dense city. In 2020, there was an accidental nitrate explosion in the port of Beirut, and that killed 250 people, injured thousands, and destroyed thousands of homes and businesses, and was just extremely traumatizing to the population. And so in the 1-year anniversary of that explosion, Adib's team led a planting of a memorial forest in one of the neighborhoods that was affected by the blast. And the community was invited to participate. The families of people who had been lost in the blast were invited to participate. And for each person lost, their name was written on paper and planted with a tree. And so the idea here is that that restoring nature is also healing to us as individuals and communities. And in Adib's words, we can heal the land damaged by the explosion and urbanization, while the land heals us through the act of planting. And I think that is a really relevant application of these community-based ecosystem restoration method like this, that connection that it creates with nature can heal us as much as it does heal the land. So Paris, France is similar to Beirut, very dense and very paved. And recent heat waves in Paris have been deadly. Those heat waves are going to become more frequent. And so city leaders are grappling with how to help the city adapt to a destabilizing climate. They've worked on lots of different sort of visioning documents, a Paris resilience plan, a Paris climate adaptation plan, a Paris biodiversity plan, and a Paris tree plan. And one concept that that has come from those planning documents is the idea of creating green corridors through the city, which are linear spaces connecting woods and parks, and that are, so like basically tree-lined streets that would form a web through the city, and not only to facilitate wildlife and biodiversity moving through the city, birds being able to get across the city and have enough resources on the way, but also creating a web of tree-lined streets and green space for people to get across the city on a hot day. And so the idea is specifically to create enough green corridors and green cooling islands that nobody is ever more than a 7-minute walk from a cooler space when they're going through the city on a hot day. So when a young IT specialist named Enrico Fusto moved to Paris from his native Italy, he saw the city with fresh eyes and noticed that same thing that city leaders had noticed, that there were not really enough tree-lined streets and not really many places where nature could just develop on its own and be a little bit of wildness in the city. He also happened upon Shubendu's online talk, and just as it had clicked for Adib, it clicked for Enrico. So he proposed a mini forest to the city of Paris, and they accepted. And in 2018, Enrico organized 40 volunteers to plant this patch of, this is on the margin of the beltway that surrounds Paris. So it's just a grassy margin normally, but they planted it in this, like a stretch of mini forest. So this picture here was taken a few months after the March planting. And then I got to visit it just shy of 3 years later. So I walked into the site with Enrico. He opened the gate. You can see a black fence, barely see a black fence there on the left, upper left. And so we walked through the gate, and there was a little path around the forest, and we could walk around and look in on the vegetation, which was already a lot taller and fuller than it is here after 3 years. And then I visited again a year and a half after that. And I again met Enrico, who opened the gate to get in. And actually, there was absolutely no getting in, because you open the gate and it was a wall of vegetation. So this was just a testament to me that this forest was growing as well as was expected. It was so full and tall after just a little over 4 years after the planting that you couldn't even get in to get a closer look. So let's move from Paris to the Netherlands to meet another mini forest revolution leader, Dan Bleijschrot. He's there on the right. He also learned from Shubendu about mini forests and how to plant them. And so his concern was Netherlands is a very, very urban city. And so many of the kids living in cities, if their parents don't have the means to go out to the beach or to the forest outside, then they're really just not, they're growing up without much exposure to nature. And so there's a lot of kids who are growing up in cities without a lot of exposure to nature. And Dan, when he saw Shubendu's talk about mini forests, he thought, okay, if we can't get kids to nature, let's bring nature to the kids. And so he invited Shubendu to lead the first mini forest planting in the Netherlands in 2015. And that was in partnership with a school. And today, at least 230 schools across the country have mini forests now, thanks to Dan's team. And so for each of those mini forests, it was the kids who planted it, and are now growing up right beside those little forests that are also growing up. And their teachers have integrated forest-based lessons into the curricula. So that's a model that I think is really cool and applicable in many places. So let's jump over to this side of the Atlantic for a moment and way over to the Pacific Northwest, where the Yakama Nation planted a healing forest in 2020 at a correctional facility. And the idea here was not only to restore degraded land, but also to help people reconnect to their cultural heritage, and specifically to provide a healing space for residents at the correctional facility. So Elder Mary Lee Jones was one of the leaders of this project. She's in the upper left there. She explained to me that plants have long been considered by the Yakama people as family members. Each plant species has its own unique personality and purpose that are recognized and respected. And so the native plants here are living links to pre-colonial Yakama tradition. And Mary Lee is really dedicated to helping people reconnect to those traditions by getting to know the plants. So this mini forest was also kind of the beginning of a journey for her, because she has, the Yakama Nation has planted 2, and they expanded the original one they planted at the correctional facility. And then Mary Lee has also joined other planting efforts around the country, including the one, at least one of the 2 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Okay, let's hop back over to Europe. And these pictures are from Roscoff, France, which is the place I was living when I was writing the book. And so as I was getting to know the mini forest stories of Shubendu, Mary Lee, Adib, Enrico, Dan, and several others, I was asking myself, can I do this? And so I want to tell you my story, because I can, and I did, and if I can do it, you can do it too. So this particular place in France where I was living is as a rural space on the coast in Brittany. And because of the ocean being right there, sort of almost on 3 sides of the town, which jutted out into the ocean. And then also there being a lot of open space in the area because of it being agricultural, one has the impression of being surrounded by nature. But if you look closely, pretty much all of the vegetation in the area is managed, and much of it quite heavily managed. So here on the right is our mini forest site. And this was a grassy field used for seasonal parking and surrounded by a hedge of tamarisk, which is actually native to Eastern Europe and Asia. And so not necessarily able to support a lot of native fauna in this particular place. And then many yards in town were adorned with palm trees, also not native to that area, but able to survive because of the mild oceanic climate there. And then there were fields of artichoke, cauliflower, and onions surrounding the town, and then sometimes even growing in between houses in town. So in short, the vast forest that once grew here is long forgotten. And that made figuring out what native species to plant at our site complicated, because there was almost no reference or model to follow. So I teamed up with a local environmental organization, and we then reached out to the National Botanical Conservatory of Brest, which has a listing of all the native species in the region. And But that listing of native species was not specific enough because it covers all sorts of different kinds of microclimates and terrain. And so then the Nature Conservancy, the Botanical Conservancy directed us towards a study that had been done about 10 years prior on coastal oak woods along this stretch of coast. And so we were really lucky to find that study. And it basically listed the species for a couple different types of oak woods communities on that coast that were different based on different conditions, one in a more sheltered bay, one in a more exposed area. And so we just looked at the species list that was in that study for a site that was really similar to our site here in terms of the conditions of the site. And then we used those species as our species list to plant. So, this was great. So we had our species list. We had the town's blessing. They helped us to find that site. They gave us permission to plant there, donated some of the city landscapers' time to help prepare the ground and build that deer and rabbit protection fence. And then our next step was to engage local partners. So we reached out to the 2 local elementary schools in town and a nearby agricultural high school. And that became part of our planting team. And we also raised some of the money we needed through tree sponsorships. And so basically we reached out to people in the community and to offer a chance to sponsor 1 or more trees for a few euros per tree. And that worked out really well. And then we recognized the sponsors on a sign in front of the mini forest. And we also invited them to come to a Saturday planting day. So the kids planted in their, with their teachers on a Thursday, and the following Saturday, the community members who had sponsored trees came and planted the other half of the site. And then a really cool outcome of this is that a neighboring town saw what we were doing and decided to plant a mini forest in collaboration with their elementary schools the following year. So they did that just last year in the neighboring town. So here is the site that we planted on the right, that we planted in December of 2021. And this is a picture taken the following spring. On the left are just a couple more pictures of the planting day. But I'm going to wrap up the talk now, and I just want to emphasize a few points in closing. So for me, the mini forest revolution is an invitation to anyone and everyone to look at the landscapes around us with fresh eyes and to notice what is the biome that I'm living in? What kind of, am I living in a temperate forest biome, or is this a tall grass prairie biome, or what is the biome? We don't always pay attention to that because there's a lot of distractions with all of the human built environment. But to think about that, and to think about what would the land look like if it were free to develop on its own, and what are the spaces around us where we could let nature express herself more fully without disrupting human activity. And there are spaces like that, which is what's cool about mini forests, because you don't have to take over a huge space. It can be, just a corner of an edge of a parking lot or something. And then if we did that, if we let nature express herself more fully in certain parts of our community, or in several parts of our communities, what kinds of extreme weather are we experiencing that healthy ecosystems, even small ones, could help boost our resilience to? And then lastly, what are the creative ways we can integrate mini forests into school and university curricula to build the ecological awareness of young people in a systemic way. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion.
Oh my goodness, Hannah, thank you so much. That was really amazing. And thank you for teaching us the power, so many powers of mini forest. People listening, doesn't that make you want to get at least one started here in Newton? There's so many ways to go, but as I'm trying to start thinking practically about it and trying to lay out areas in the city of Newton where we are, what's the minimum size that you think we could look for it?
That is kind of a tricky question because, for example, in the Netherlands, Dan Bleichrot and his organization are promoting mini forest gardens in backyards. And so, you can make it as small as you want, really, because, any amount of native vegetation is going to make a positive difference. But Miyawaki too, he talked about, planting something just as narrow as 1 meter wide, maybe in a long strip. But there's a caveat there, which is he would call that more of a green screen, not a forest of any type, because and Elgene Box really emphasized this with me when I was talking to him, that to be something like a forest, you need to have an interior space that's protected from sun coming in the sides. You can't have sun come in one side and out the other side. You need to have an interior space that holds the humidity and the shade and the deep shade like a forest does. Otherwise, it doesn't have sort of that integral resilience that a forest has. So that said, I think, if you want to maintain that interior space, I think the size that people are going with that's still small is like the size of a parking lot. So size of a tennis court, size of a tennis court. So like 200 square meters is a pretty reasonable size to still maintain some of that microclimate inside.
And do you find that when you plant it all at once and you don't have that interior, that the plants will be all right as long as it takes to develop and get that interior?
Yeah. Well, that's why you need to pay attention to it for the first few years. You need to weed it, because the weeds will use that sun and grow faster than the trees if you don't stay on top of the weeds. And then, grasses or whatever. And then also you may need to water periodically. In Paris, that one that they planted, they only needed to water, I think, a couple times towards the end of the summer in August when it was getting really dry and hot. But it really depends on what's going on with the weather and the temperature, if you're getting much rain or not, if it's super hot or not. So it's just a matter of monitoring it, checking under the mulch to see how the soil is, and if it's still moist under there or if it's dried out under there, and then watering accordingly. So as long as you do that, that's fine. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it can kind of take care of itself once it has formed its canopy after 2 or 3 years.
Okay, we have more practical questions, but I'm going to step back once with a little bit with a general question. How old is the oldest mini forest right now?
The first one that Miyawaki planted was in 1971 or 72 possibly. But so, yeah, it's pretty old, about 50 years.
Okay, fascinating. We've got to look up and get more photos of these fully developed ones. That would be really neat to see.
Yeah.
To give even more inspiration.
Miyawaki wrote a book himself called The Healing Power of Forests, and I believe the cover picture that's out of print and it's hard to get your hands on, but you could probably see a picture of it online. Okay. But there are pictures in that of his fully developed forests, and they just look like regular regular forests. They're tall and thick.
Oh, neat. We have a note here from attendee to inspire us further, if we need even another ounce of inspiration, who said a few of us took part in a planting of a mini forest in Ayr a few weeks ago, the first of a number there. Also, a mini forest is planned for a municipal park in Groveland next April. That's really neat to know. We may be talking to you for even more advice. We have a question from a great gardener here named Anne, and she asks, are the plant quantities selected to emulate what you might expect a mature climax forest to have? So a few larger trees and more smaller and shade understory plants. You start out with what you think you need in the end, or do you start out and let it fight it out?
You start out with a higher proportion of the canopy trees, and like I think it's at least 50% or so, and 50-60% of the canopy and the bigger trees, and a smaller amount of shrubs, and then the first year, Miyawaki's survival rate is like 95%. They're growing in really good conditions, so they're really doing well. And then over time, after 4 or 5 years, then the survival rate goes down to about 70, is what Miyawaki's colleague Fujiwara explained to me. So they are starting to kind of like take their space, and some of them are falling away. But yeah, so but Miyawaki emphasized that in a healthy mature forest, you will have actually a higher proportion of the bigger trees.
Okay, neat. So a person is asking here just what I've been thinking. Now, it was clear the sites where you planted are not necessarily near to someone's water connection hookup. How did you get them watered for those first years? Where did you get them?
Yeah, that's such an important question that you have to think about ahead of time. So for the one we did in Roscoff in France, the city, and many cities have this, they have just a water tank on a truck. And so the truck comes with the water tank, and then there's a hose and you can water that way. So and I think that's what they did in Paris as well. I think that's probably a good thing to look into if there's not a tap nearby.
Okay. We fortunately have good connections with our forestry folks, so that is nice, a good way to go about it.
Yeah. Someone
else asks, how would you rate doing a pollinator garden versus doing a mini forest?
Well, I think they're both great for starters. I think if it's in a small space, and I guess ecologically speaking, they're both important, but maybe it's just whichever one fits the space better.
Makes sense.
I used to live in Iowa, where the native ecosystem is tall grass prairie. And so, there's a lot of prairie restoration efforts there, which is great. I think one thing though with prairies is that often they depend on fire or grazing to maintain as prairies. So if it can be maintained, then having sort of a native pollinator garden or prairie type strip would work, but that would require maintenance, as opposed to if it's in a forest, a climate that can support forests, then you don't need to bother with doing a disturbance. The forest will just maintain itself if it's the right climate for that.
We've got more practical ones, but I want to go back to a question that I have. I was really moved by how the people were connected, healed, how it seemed to bring communities together. I really loved the idea of the naming ceremony and naming the plants. And that seems so educational too, besides just being a wonderful tradition. Is that done other places? Is that become a common part of these plantings?
Not necessarily. That was definitely Miyawaki's signature, and I'm not sure other people have adopted it. But when I was talking to Dan about that, he said, we should really be doing that in our plantings as well. I don't know if they have, but I think I think Miyawaki set a really, really great precedent of including lots of people. And that is very much the standard of what people are doing today too, is like just including lots of different people and making it a community event. So that part has happened. And I think people do integrate education into it in their own ways. But the naming ceremony, no, I haven't heard about other projects doing that, but Miyawaki, it was definitely what he did.
Oh, neat. The Yakima tradition is incredible too, about setting up the pre-colonial planting and having it be a link to the past. I really like that. We've got to do 2 or 3 of these to get everything done. That's amazing. We have landscape architect Ted asking us here, if the planting includes true canopy species such as oak, which are slow growing, how do they survive with the diversity of faster growing species?
Well, that's the reason why you want to keep it to climax species. So the pioneer species tend to grow faster. And that's actually the main reason, that's kind of the main reason that Miyawaki did not want to include pioneer species in the planting, is because they would grow up fast and shade out the oaks and other climax species. And then you would just get an earlier successional forest, which was not, Miyawaki's goal was to create sort of a stable community that would just persist there without big changes. And it would reach that sort of that climax state right away. So yeah, that's avoid pioneers. That's the way to allow the oaks and other climax species to grow in full sunlight.
Okay, we have a lot of questions that are very specific to Newton, which maybe we should get back to individually. Someone, but I'm just going to read one of them, which is said, do you think we would have to take land by eminent domain in order to accomplish this in Newton? And no, I think that's one thing we need to talk about it as a community, but I know there are some edges of schools one in particular that might be possible. I've been looking everywhere I go now, and I look at in Newton Center Playground, for example, across the street, that strip is a city-owned sort of ratty forest right now. And I think, it's hilly, it's sloped. Oh, that is an interesting question. Has this been done on other than level that you know of, on other than level land?
Yeah. And Miyawaki emphasizes that too, that it's a good way to kind of stabilize sloping ground. And he actually, when it's really sloping, he would put terraces in. And the terraces was partly to just, partly it was to accommodate the planters themselves, so that people weren't scrambling around on sloping ground, but also to be able to add the compost and like really get that soil sort of stabilized. So he would do terraces on sloped land. And you mentioned a ratty forest. One of the events that I was able to participate in was in a degraded woods of a suburb of Paris. And so this woods, it had all been planted at the same time with a very small number of species. And I think they were fast growing. They were more like pioneer tree species. They all grew up, and they were all kind of reaching their age limit. And so there was not that much diversity and in age of the plants or of the trees or of the, the species. So so the woods was not really doing well. So they actually did a mini forest planting there as a way to start to restore those woods. So the mini forest there, they used a space that was already clear. They didn't take out any trees to do it, but they planted in a clearing. And then the idea was that, there would be, those would generate seeds also, to kind of spread out into that woods to increase the diversity of the woods, sort of like almost like an inoculant for that wood to spread out more species there.
How neat. Okay, I've got to ask you this question, the dread question. In our established forests here in Newton, invasive plants are an enormous problem. Mm-hmm. So, and I know it's better when you're in the center and our open spaces, it's the edges that are most mm-hmm. open. So when you have a small forest, are they more prone to invasives, and what do you do about it?
That is a really good question. And in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, we're asking that too, because we have buckthorn everywhere. Yeah. And I was just in Washington at a mini forest planting, Washington State, and they have a handful of really aggressive species, non-native species. So I'm still curious to see how that will work. But I guess one thing I observed in Washington, and I guess it's similar to what this person was just saying, but so all through the campus there, there's just sort of these little wooded areas that are kind of, they're not like intact really areas. They're just patches of vegetation here and there, and you can see invasives all over. But then we walked in an old growth forest, and it was absolutely pristine inside. And it was so big that it couldn't be that like armies of volunteers were pulling out the invasives every time. So I think like the integral health of the ecosystem creates that balance that resists the invasives. That was my sort of takeaway from that. And so for a small forest, the only thing I can say is, it doesn't have that that huge presence of a larger intact forest that can create that balance. But I guess what I'm curious to see is if the ecological health that we're investing in a mini forest from the very beginning, if that helps create balance that resists some of these invasives. And one other thing to say about that is that I'm only talking about shade tolerant invasives, because any invasives that any non-native plants or unwanted plants that need sun will not make it in that forest.
That would be a fascinating study to do over time, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, Barbara has a question, and given the great work she does as our technical host, we're going to ask her question. I'm trying to go through them. We're running out of time, but Barbara asks, how do you manage deadfall in a mini forest?
You leave it. You leave it. That's those dead fallen trees are important habitat for all the critters that you want to give a leg up to in those mini forests. So just leave it alone inside the forest. If it falls out of the forest, if it falls the wrong direction, then probably the city will want to deal with that somehow. But just leave anything that falls in the forest there. Let it just do its own thing and take its own course inside the forest, because that's the goal. We're trying to have this ecosystem be self-sustaining and not be tended to, really.
Neat. Okay, I got to be very picky here at the end. We have a couple questions from people who are interested in doing these mini forests on private land. Are there examples of that? I mean, like people's own yards?
Yeah. Well, like in the Netherlands, they're encouraging that. So they have mini forest garden kits. And I think I think it's like little simple instructions and then a handful of species, not many, not many plants overall. And then people plant them in their yard. So, and they also, in accompaniment with that, they wrote, and unfortunately this is only in Dutch, maybe it'll be translated, but Dan wrote a book on how to plant a mini forest garden in your backyard.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, if only we could read that. That would be amazing.
Yeah. So, and then, but on private land, yeah, absolutely. That first one that I mentioned that like made me aware of the mini forest idea to begin with, that was in France, and that they planted by a recently expanded road, that was on private land. But yeah, it's plenty on private land and on public land. I think it's probably more simple if it's on private land and the landowner wants to do that.
Okay. Okay. We have a comment from Linda who says Watertown has plans to install a Miyawaki forest in the next year or so. We were inspired by Hannah's book and Cambridge forests. It's good to know we have so many guides we can turn to as we start to try to do this in Newton. Someone says, how do these forests age? What happens over time?
Well, Miyawaki would say, we're going to plant this forest here today, and it's going to remain here until the next ice age.
Oh,
so that was his understanding. That was his vision. And that's the idea of planting in the absence of, a major disturbance. It's, forests just stay, and they continue. And that's the idea with these forests too.
Well, what an amazing thing to say. What a terrific concept. And thank you so much for presenting it to us and inspiring us all. And we will get to some of the questions, particularly about Newton going forward. I always send out a write-up the next day. I'm sorry, I can't send out the link to that book from the Netherlands unless somebody here speaks Dutch and feels like doing a little translation for us. But thank you very much. Thank you. If any of you have questions, you can submit them to Hannah at webinars@newtonconservators.org. Thank you so very much, Hannah. This has been wonderful. And good night, everyone. Hope to see you next month.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.